7 weeks after its first recorded coronavirus case, New York has become the global center of the pandemic. In New York City, a staggering 1 in 800 residents has died from the disease, which continues to kill hundreds of New Yorkers every day. New York City is sick, and journalists, pundits, and politicians have made a diagnosis. The city's exceptional density is the problem. That certainly is the self-serving conclusion of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. It's a convenient bit of fatalism for a man presiding over a catastrophe. At the core of this theory is the idea that New York City is just different. New York Cities and New Yorkers live their lives in close proximity. They share laundromats, lobbies, elevators, subway trains, and crowded sidewalks. No U.S. city has more inhabitants per square mile or higher rates of public transit use. The coronavirus supposedly was destiny. It seems highly unlikely that any response by the state or city could have fully stopped the pandemic. Joel Kotkin, an urban commentator who basically was upset, could barely contain his glee at the prospect that New Yorkers might finally pack up for the Dallas suburbs. Like any misdiagnosis, this is going to make it harder to find the cure. A cursory look at a map shows that New York City's coronavirus cases aren't correlated with neighborhood density at all. Staten Island, the city's least crowded borough, has the highest positive test result and rates of the 5 boroughs. Manhattan, the city's densest borough, has its lowest. Nor are deaths correlated with public transit use. The epidemic began in the city's northern suburbs. The city's per capita fatalities are identical to those in neighboring Nassau County, the home of Levittown, a typical suburban county with a household income that's twice that of New York City. So true, New York City apartments are crowded. The share of housing units with more than one occupant per room is almost 10%. But that number is 13% in the city of Los Angeles. As a metro area, New York isn't even in the top 15 U.S. cities for overcrowding. It's not even the American city with the most apartments per capita. That's Miami. Or immigrants, it's also Miami. To take 2 other characteristics that critics say might be associated with the coronavirus infections. New York City has a lot of restaurants per capita, places where people gather with strangers every night, but not as many as San Francisco, which, though it ranks second in the United States for both residential density and transit use, had just 20 COVID-19 deaths as of Friday. If you expand your comparison internationally, New York City looks less exceptional still. It's not as dense or transit dependent as, say, Paris. That has less than half the New York fatality rate, or Seoul, Korea, where the pandemic has all but been controlled. So, what is it about New York City that made it a hotspot? Right now, looks like the most exceptional thing about New York is its leaders' belief that the city is unique. This presumption served first as a reassurance that New York would not follow Lombardy's example, and later as the reason why it had. Cuomo used the former logic on March 2nd, arguing, when you're saying what happened in other countries versus what happened here, we don't even think it's going to be as bad as it was in other countries. Well, that's a familiar idea. New York is what it is, whether it's budgeting for subways or picking up garbage, and will take no lessons. Once New York had followed and surpassed Lombardy's infection rate, well, that was New York's exceptionalism too. Given the density that we're dealing with, it spreads very quickly, Cuomo said something like 3 weeks later. Exceptional things that are about New York are the Yankees, the Mets, Brian Lehrer, Coney Island, the Brooklyn Bridge, and Jackson Heights. Unexceptional things about New York are international flights, immigrants, the fact that its residents live in apartment buildings, suffer from overcrowding as a result of high housing costs, and use public transit. These factors will surely prove to have hastened the spread, but they won't explain New York's divergence from other world cities. Tragically, what seems to have put New York on such a different trajectory from San Francisco was that its leaders were so late to shut down public life. Research by the epidemiologists Britta and Nicholas Jewell suggests that 90% of COVID-19 deaths in the United States could have been prevented by enacting social distancing policies 2 weeks earlier than we did. Former CDC Director Tom Friedman told City and State that if New York had shut things down earlier, could have cut the death toll by as much as 80%. New York's stay-at-home order began 5 days after California's, and its schools were closed 4 days after Seattle's. History will be pretty critical of Cuomo and de Blasio for not taking the same decisive decisions that Mayor London Breed took in San Francisco. Furthermore, serious outbreaks have occurred in small towns too. Rural hotspots like St. John the Baptist Parish in Louisiana and Dougherty County, Georgia, have had similar death rates to New York City. South Dakota now has one of the largest coronavirus hotspots in the country, despite Governor Nick Christie Noem's assurances that South Dakota is not New York City. This recognition is not about doling out blame to New York politicians for what happened in March. Washington was worse than useless, from the president to the CDC. Cuomo and Mayor Bill de Blasio had to make difficult decisions that inflicted their own types of suffering, particularly closing the city's public schools. Now, it's about what happens next. The sooner New York can be honest about why its outbreak was so severe, the sooner leaders can figure out how to move forward. In fact, it's a precursor to moving forward. Who's going to want to open a restaurant when political leaders still believe contagion is in the city's DNA? And why should Washington help prop up a subway system that's perceived to be an outsized disease vector? That is a tough balance. Reopening New York is going to be a lot harder than reopening Vermont. The average New Yorker makes contact with 75 people a day. Proposals in California and New Jersey that restaurants operate at half capacity are going to be really hard to adapt at Momofuku and Corner Bistro. And then there's all the shared public spaces, from libraries to parks to the subways, that have to be kept clean enough to keep the virus in check, and just as importantly, to inspire the confidence that it is clean. The system keeping New York City safe will need to be better than it is elsewhere. Washington will have to recognize that a New York safe from disease, like two decades ago, a New York had to be safe from terrorism, well, that requires special resources. The level of everyday civic awareness will be higher for a long time. Others have doubts about the city's long-term future. How will tourism rebound? Will white-collar workers who are accustomed to typing from their couches still pay to cluster in Manhattan? Will Manhattan families come out of deciding they want to stay in their backyards? Will the feds provide enough aid that hard-hit cities and states don't have to cut services all the way to the bone? Well, these are good questions, but we can't start to answer them before we assure ourselves and others that New York City is not unsafe by design.